Hello and welcome to the Subjective Space with Sindhu Rajasekaran. We have an absolutely gorgeous guest with us today. It is Mirri Glasson-Darling. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. She lives in Glasgow, Scotland right now, where she moved to from Alaska. She has received a notable essay in Best American Essays, a Pushcart nomination from Passages North, and a fiction award from Intro to Journals. Work of hers has appeared in Plowshares, Colorado Review, Florida Review, Gulf Coast, Willow Springs, Crab Orchard Review, The Pinch, and many others. Though predominantly publishing in fiction, Mirri has also written award-winning poetry and essays. She's a queer writer and tends towards literary fiction with an ecological bend, often featuring speculative or fantastical elements. She completed her MFA at Virginia Tech and is currently wrapping up her PhD at the University of Strathclyde. She was born in rural Iowa. Mirri comes from a Midwest background but has spent the majority of her adult life in Alaska, which we will talk about. She is an avid long-distance runner and outdoors person. Her time in backcountry, both in Alaska and the Highlands, often influences her work. She is currently querying for a literary novel, a young adult novel, and a collection of short stories. So welcome, Mirri, to the Subjective Space.
Yay.
Thank you for talking to me.
Yeah, thank you
All
so
right.
much for having
So,
me.
oh, you're welcome. So, that was a bunch of stuff that I read out in your bio just there. That's amazing. Congratulations. That's a lot of stuff you've done. And it's amazing. So let's first start off by, we will get to all this stuff that you've done in the mountains. But before that, let's talk about the sort of theme that sort of draws all your stuff together. I would say you write nonfiction, you write fiction, you write poetry, you write a bunch of things. They're all sort of surreal. There is like an element of surrealism in your work, right? So have you always written, fantastical, surreal stuff? And what drew you to this sort of writing? Do you have any inspirations, favorite authors?
Well, so I started out as a fantasy writer, by which I mostly mean that when I was in middle school and high school, I wrote a lot of really terrible fantasy novels, pretty nonstop. I wrote about 37 of them. Mostly they were notebooks, but they were all like 200 pages in notebooks or more. So when I say they were novels, I'm not kidding. They were just terrible. So I've always had fantastical elements, and that has always been what interests me about fiction. I'm very like imagery based, probably is how I describe myself as a writer. But when I started going into literary fiction, it was sort of kicking and screaming, more or less, just because like I was in uni, and if you want to be read, you will be taking workshops, and I didn't write fantasy for workshops. I tried to do literary fiction, and through the process of that, I kind of figured out what I like about literary fiction, what I don't like. I did my undergraduate at the University of Iowa, so the cohort of the Iowa Writers Workshop were my teachers. So it was like a very traditional the house style of Iowa Writer Workshop fiction, which didn't always work really well with me necessarily, but it definitely was like a really good technical foundation. So I have always written with surreal elements when I'm writing what I want to write. There was certainly a time when... Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, did you have any like authors that sort of like pushed you toward that sort of space? Did you read anybody that sort of felt like, oh my God, this is what I want to be writing?
I mean, I'm a big Ursula K. Le Guin fan. So I'm a huge fan of her. So I really like all of that. The first literary fiction that I ever read that I really liked was by Kafka. I kind of like anything that feels very strange. So, I love Karen Russell. I like Swamplandia a lot. I love Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping. There isn't any fantastical elements in that book, but the way the landscape is constructed feels very otherworldly. It feels very ethereal, very underwater. So all
Yeah.
of that is what draws me to literary fiction, and that's kind of what I like to write. So I've always had elements of that. I've always been very world based, which I think comes from
Yeah.
like having been like a 12-year-old who was writing these terrible fantasy novels. I was just very into world building. And when, I became an adult and turned to literary fiction, world building is the environment. World building is mountains. World building is description and like what the place around you is in terms of imagery. So I have always written in that way.
So now that you mentioned mountains, let's talk about mountaineering, right? Like I know you hike alone and you climb mountains alone, and that's like a cause of stress for some people. They're like, "Why are you doing this stuff alone?" Like, and you're going off into the rocks and the mountains, and you're like spending time with the clouds and the sheep, I think. So, what sort of truths do you see when you're up alone there? Like, does it give you like a clarity, or does it muddle things up more? Because as it is, I understand that we all have very tenuous relationships with reality, like what is reality, which is reality, whatever. So when you're up alone in the mountains, do you feel like things come together for you, or does it sort of, I don't know, what does it do for you?
Well, so it's sort of interesting because this is always something that people ask me, like, because I do go on my own and I prefer to be alone. Almost all of my hiking I do alone. I do very rarely go out with other people, and I have like a one hiking friend here. But so I do want to like make a distinction really really quickly, just because like I know to some people when they say climbing they think like rock climbing, and rock climbing is not a solo sport. I couldn't do bouldering alone, but I don't like bouldering. I'm not that great a rock climber because everything I do I tend to do alone. So I haven't really
Yeah.
done much of that. But like so most of the time when I am in the mountains, and when you're in the mountains and you're doing something athletic, you're not really thinking really high grand thoughts. You're kind of doing a whole lot of like, I hope that weather doesn't get me.
Yeah.
I would like to not fall in this river and drown. And like it's kind of a lot of those sorts
Yeah.
of thoughts, but there is like
Yeah.
a clarity in
I
them.
mean, you have hurt yourself quite a bit, like doing these sports.
I almost
You
died in a
have
river
sort of
once.
broken your leg. Yeah. Yeah. So
Um,
you have done that.
so yeah, I mean, I've never suffered any broken bones or any major injuries. The time I almost died in a river, I didn't die in a river. I grabbed a tree branch, and it was like a very, I mean, it's really easy to make certain mistakes once you've like been in an area a lot and done the same route a lot, and that was what had happened. Like I saw all the signs that the water was too high, and I just went anyway because I'd crossed that river like, I don't know, 25 times.
Yeah. You're like, I
Fine.
can do
But that
this.
day it wasn't.
Yeah.
But that day it wasn't. So,
It was just one of those days, I guess.
yeah. So, I mean, the sort of thoughts like, I don't know that I do a lot of like really high minded thinking, but I do a lot of feeling, if that makes sense. Like when
Do
I
you take
used to do
notes and
marathon,
stuff? Do you like take notes or anything? Like, or you're just like
I
when you're
keep a
up there in the
journal, but
mountains,
a
do
lot
you?
of it,
Mm-hmm.
I keep a journal that I'll go to in the tent at night. But a lot of times you're
Mm-hmm.
kind of too tired, or it'll be a lot of like, I don't know what I'm doing with my life, but there won't be more to say. It'll be like,
Yeah.
I saw one of my entries from when I was in the mountains in Alaska, and it was just like, I am so lonely. And that's it.
I mean, you chose to go
That's
up there all by yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. I like doing that though. There's no one to distract you from yourself. If you are feeling a big thing, you can do it, and there's no one around to feel weird about. You don't need to feel judged or like you're putting anything upon someone. Like when I used to run marathons, I'd pretty much always have like a little tiny breakdown around like mile 17. Like you just like start crying. You don't even necessarily know why. I should also add that I didn't run with music at the time. That doesn't have if you run music.
Yeah.
Like you just got a lot of
Yeah.
time to think.
Yeah.
But you get through it and you come out the other side. So hiking is kind of similar. Like, you know, you like say you're doing a 16-hour day, say you're hiking like 24 miles and like 5 mountains or whatever. you'll have like how you feel will really fluctuate, and you might not necessarily be thinking about like, you know, I don't know, the shape of existence or whatever, but you're very in it, and you're very in your body, and you're very in yourself, and whatever you're feeling, it will come out. And if you are trying to think about something, you'll kind of think it to death. Like, you know,
Yeah.
if you've gone through a breakup, yeah, you can be sad about that for a while, but if you think
Yeah.
about that for like 5 hours straight, you will run out of
Mm-hmm.
steam.
Yeah.
I don't
What
have
more can you
anything
think
done
about
for
it? Like,
like
yeah.
you run out of like you
Yeah.
find clarity in that, but it's kind of more like a quiet, it's like a quiet
Mm.
sort of thing. It's not, or at least me, I mean, maybe there are lots of other people that go out and are like discovering great
Mm.
giant truths or something, but for me
Why
it's
I
just sort of
ask you
like think,
about this, I was just going to say
you know,
why
it's
I
okay.
ask you about this is because in your writing there is like a very sort of like a it's you know there is this sort of connection between language and landscape, right? Like because you've traveled so much, because you've been in all these places, and the way you write it's so atmospheric. Like you know the story that you publish in Plowshares, for instance, it's about a person who is on the mountain, and then it's all of those things, and the clouds, and you know how everything sort of plays into the narrative itself. So the sort of language becomes the landscape, or the language, I don't know how you see it, but there is that
No,
connection
I do.
between the two. Yeah. So I was going to ask you about, you know, you lived in Alaska, you lived in Iowa, you lived in Scotland, and you've also sort of climbed all these places. So do you think you write differently in different landscapes, or do they affect you in a way, and your writing, do you see any sort of relationship between the two?
I mean, I can definitely tell where I was thinking about when I wrote certain stories. Like
Mm-hmm.
Corey Reed, you know, the story in Plowshares is the first like story I've ever written, and the only thing still that like takes place in Scotland. Um, and it is based very much on real mountain experiences I've had here. Like how it opens with like the woman seeing like these two faceless figures in the mountains. That story was inspired because it literally happened. Like and it was exactly like that too. Like they weren't actually faceless. They had like really thick midge nets on. But when you're alone and you're really far out, like you just see things and they're so weird and you can't explain them. You just kind of like trust, like there's probably not actually faceless people
Yeah.
here. That's probably not true. But like, you know, like
Yeah.
I got really, really close before I could tell there weren't. Like I was like, they were in front of me and I waved and they still seemed faceless when I waved. Like I was just like, well, I gotta make this normal somehow.
Yeah.
When it
Yeah.
occurred to me, like, oh no, it's just a really thick net.
So
So,
so
and
they
that's
were
definitely like a
human.
Scottish thing. Yeah, they were human. It was a man and his son out camping.
Okay.
But
Okay.
I mean, they looked like faceless figures, and they were also like they matched their tent, and they matched it. It was like I don't know what their deal was, but it was, you know, very weird.
Yeah.
So, but
Yeah.
like
That
that's, I
that
mean,
brings me
that's
to
you
the
don't have.
question of, no, sorry, go
Yeah, no,
on.
it's
I was
okay.
just going to say that brings me the question of like reality itself, right? Like you were talking about, like, you know, who are these creatures? Like, so how do you see this in your own reality, like this reality that we are in, and also in your writing? Like, what are the sort of different planes of existence that you inhabit, and like. Do you find any one reality very mundane, and do you find the other sort of more exciting?
Well, I mean, the nature is pretty magical in and of itself. Like you have all of these natural things that happen that, I mean, I've seen in the mountains, I've seen in Alaska, and I've also seen here. Something I've seen several times, just very lucky, is Fata Morgana, which is like it's an optical illusion that's caused by a temperature inversion, where you will see like these strange sort of plateau-like mountains where there are no mountains, and it's like the
Mm-hmm.
light bending down from like a higher mountain or buildings and like in the distance behind you usually. But it's like really cool and really strange. You know, you have St. Elmo's fire, which happens when, like, in certain weather conditions, like thunderstorms or like down by the Arctic, where like the particles ionize around, like, you know, ship mass and all of this. And for years, you know, people were like, "Oh, this isn't real," like, you know, and all like, "Oh, ball lightning isn't real," and then, you know, it is, and it's scientifically. So there's a lot that's very magical and feels very surreal um nature, not nature, like the natural world in general. And so, like, reality, I always find that I like when I first like thought about that, I had a minute where I was like, you mean like alternate realities and aliens or something? Because I don't really have opinions about those.
Yeah.
I mean, but growing up, like, I was really weird and read a lot of books, and you know, I was writing all these terrible fantasy books. And a lot of the books that I loved started out in real life, and then, you know, someone would like skip realities and go into this fantasy world. So I fully expected that to happen, probably until I was about like 14. That was what I thought would happen to me. Like, I didn't think that the life I lived in was going to be the life I had. It's not that I didn't think it was real. I just didn't think it was what would happen.
Yeah.
So, like, reality as an adult and all of these things, yeah, there's certainly something very mundane about it. But there's a lot of, like, weird sort of... I mean, it's not actually magic, but, like, magic in the world, at least in terms of, like, the natural world. So I find a lot of, like, I guess, it sounds very silly to say, I find a lot of joy in that. Like, I love...
That's not silly.
I mean, I love, like, when I used to go like marathon run in the Arctic, you know, like, I remember one time you have all the fog was, you get ice fog that's so thick. And when I say ice fog, I mean like the fog itself is frozen. So it's like little tiny particles in the air that are frozen, but it's like a really thick fog, and it makes the sound very strange. And you'll get it when there's lots of sea ice, like, melting or moving in. And so, like, I was out running one time, and like there's a sled dog team in Utervik where I used to live, and like they were miles away. They're probably like 3 miles away, but like they all started to howl. Like, every dog started to howl. So I'm like in this mist where I can't see anything. I can just hear these like weird dogs howling. I very irresponsibly, when I was much younger, used to, like, when I lived there, I used to go running in blizzards, which is a terrible idea. But it really messes with your senses.
Like, yeah.
I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, like, yeah, reality can be very boring, especially, like, I mean, I was working an office job when I lived in the Arctic. You know, I went to an office and I sat there, but like there's plenty of more magical, like, interesting things that exist, like, in the reality we live in, like, with the natural world. So, I mean, I get really sad when I can't get out in it.
I think that's the funny thing, right? Because we assume this reality is like just like so bland and so boring in a sense, but actually this reality is itself magical. Like you just rightly said, like there's so much in nature that brings you joy. Like I mean, it's how you see reality, right? Like, what is reality to you? What is alternate reality to you? Whatever. So let's talk about the folklore and the speculative writing that you do. Like, there's a lot of folklore in your writing, right? So is that something that you grew up with? Like, did you read a lot? Like, did people tell you folk tales when you were growing up in Alaska? Or like, did you read a lot of it? And how do you weave that into your writing?
Well, I just do want to say, like, I wasn't small in Alaska. Like, I moved to Alaska when I was 21. So it's all my adult life. I'm 30, almost 37 now. But when I was little, I was living in Iowa. I read a lot of folklore growing up. I grew up like in the middle of nowhere, really, kind of. So it was a very like blank palette to put all of these ideas onto. And I mean, so folklore, I've always been really interested in folklore. Like, some of my favorite stuff when I was little, like, I really loved the Kalevala, which is like Finnish folklore. And if you're unfamiliar, it is different from other stuff. It is not Norse folklore. It was very odd. And then because a lot of folklore is so tied to landscape, and I think a lot of it's tied to the sort of magic of the natural world, like will-o-wisps or whatever, bog lights, which are also real. They have to do with gas stuff, and all of this gets interwound in folklore. So it's kind of like a natural extension to me of what's interesting. You can't really write about landscapes and not think about the folklore around them. I haven't really written necessarily that much about folklore of the Arctic because it's not the culture that I'm from, and I don't really consider those stories to be mine. But it is really wildly interesting. Like, if there are any people who love folklore out there, like Inupiaq folklore is really cool. A lot of it's very like monsters, like horror based sort of. But it's really, really cool. So it's, and that is where language and landscape meet a lot of time in like folklore. So that to me is like a natural thing that I am interested in. Again, it's been like a literary interest, right? Like when I moved to literary fiction. But I'm pretty obsessed with it now.
We will talk about what it means to be a literary writer. We will come to that in just a minute. But before that, I wanted to just, speak a little bit more about what do you think about, like you mentioned space, right? Like where the landscape and language meets. So there is this profound sense of self in your work, like when you write, like in what I've read and listened to you read. There is space, there is the self, there is also the landscape. It's very ecological, like you're an eco poet, but it's not like obviously like, you're like, oh, I'm an eco poet. Like it's very subtle, it's very beautifully done the way you write. Like I love how you write. Like I feel it's not something you can like very consciously construct, right? These are things that sort of, I don't know, magically come together. So when you're writing, how do you think about these elements like space or like the self and like the landscape? Like how do these things fit together?
Well, I'm really sort of fascinated with the idea of betweens, but like where, like boundaries and how they kind of aren't real. Like, and this in my writing can be anything from, like, I definitely have some stories that are very scientific. Like, I have a story, Wolves versus Plains, which is in the Pinch, which, like, kind of obsesses about these different borderlines between, like, matter. So one of the things is, like, like you have, like, wolves eating a moose, and, like, something that's fascinating to me in general is, like, when that happens, like, at what point does, like, wolf hemoglobin, like moose hemoglobin, become wolf hemoglobin? Because that is what happens in the cell essentially when that transference happens. So I'm really obsessed with this idea of boundaries and how they aren't real. Because while they're
you're talking to the right.
Like, I mean, there comes a time when everyone kind of draws a line and people act like there are these hard lines, but the more we know about biology, the more we know about these things, the more like these porous these lines become. If you've ever tried to read anything about like theoretical physics, it's so wild. Like, space and all of these things. At what point, at what point stuff freezes, at what point things decay, and how that changes depending on different temperatures. So I think I've gone a little off track. Can you bring me back a little bit? What was the actual question?
No, actually, now that you said that, I was thinking about quantum physics and how, in quantum physics, the concept of Maya, right? The Indian concept of Maya, where reality is what you make of it. Like it doesn't exist till you see it a particular way. So quantum physics is the exact same thing now based on all that research. And I'm like, we knew this for like thousands of years. So, it's that sort of stuff, right? Like what you're saying, there are no boundaries. Like when COVID happened and when we are made of bacteria and viruses. So it's like, it's not like something is, it's sort of coming, we are already that. Like it's so weird. We think of these things as outside of us, but everything is essentially a part of us. And that brings me to like gender and all of that. Like, what is even like the boundary, right? So, but let's come back to what I was asking you about. Like I was asking you about space, the self, and the landscape. So the next question I had for you is, when you're writing, do the characters come to you first, or is it the story world? Because you spoke a lot about constructing story worlds and like constructing the world, right? So what comes to you first when you're writing?
imagery usually. I like a cool image, and then
Yeah.
I mean, well, there have been characters ever, but for me, it's sort of more like, it is sort of more like world building. My like the book that I first thought, the book that I'm completing for my PhD, Meteora, which is a working title, but the first thing that I started with was like an image of like a hand kind of covered in gold dust, like in a river in like southeast Alaska. And kind of out of that, because like there's you will have like gold dust that will mix with stuff a little bit, like you can see it kind of in the rocks in Juneau. And it's a little less gold in the actual book, but like it's, you know, like a story about like this book begins kind of with a body of someone who disappeared in the Arrogach Mountains and has been found 800 miles south. Like the body has been found 800 miles south of where this appeared. It's actually, I mean, the book is about two sisters, and the two sisters and the characters all come out of that. But it started with that image, and then like an image of like golden light, the way like which is, you know, like if you've ever been in mist and you have like the way like sunlight will hit it sometimes on water, it will look like you have like a ceiling of gold, and it will kind of trap you in this like weird all gold tunnel, and it'll mess with the light. So the book also begins with that. And so I really kind of start with like imagery, like, which is one of the reasons like I identify with the term surrealism having to do with my work, because to me it feels more like I start out with images that would kind of be a cool painting, and then the world builds around that, and the characters build in around that. I mean, characters matter a whole lot. I don't mean to kind of do like the Jack London thing where you're like, here we have the environment that is we don't really have any window into this person's brain. They're just gonna try to build a fire and die. But I start with imagery usually.
Like a great story. Like try to build a fire and you die. I mean, that's a great story.
Yeah, I mean that's to build a fire. That's that story.
Yeah, that's a story. I mean, I understand that totally, because I can like completely get lost in my characters' brains, like in their thoughts, which there's nothing like real about it. Like they're just lost in their brains for like 3 chapters. Nothing happens. They're just looking at the world. So, you know, I can totally get that, like the imagery.
But it's cool to be in someone else's head. That's world building, isn't it? You know, like to be in a different mind than yours and see how they look at it. How is that not world building?
Yeah, I agree. So let's talk about literary fiction. So first of all, I've had people ask me like, "Are you a literary writer?" And I'm like, for a long time, I was like very like, "Am I? I don't know. Like, where do I fit in?" Like, but now I'm just owning it. I'm just like, yes, I am a literary writer, whatever that means. So what does it mean to you? And obviously, we're getting a PhD in creative writing, so that means something.
Yeah. Well, see, for me, I have like weird opinions about this, because I started out in genre fiction, and when I did get into like university and was taking these workshops, I had a teacher who said something very unhelpful to me, which was and she meant so well by it, you know, it wasn't anything like that, but she read a story I had written, which was just kind of like, it wasn't even like a fantasy, it was just like had fantastical elements at all. And she said, like, you know, you're actually really good. Why are you wasting your time with this sort of thing? Like, yeah.
I mean, it's a backhanded compliment.
Yeah, and that's more or less what I got a lot of. And I took a lot of workshops. So I came to literary writing thinking kind of like, I have to not really write what I want to, but the words can be nice. So and then as I like got older, and you know, you reach a point also where you're like, I have to write what I like, because the chance, like a lot of times nobody reads it. When people do read it, it's really exciting and all of that. But I mean, I consider myself a literary writer because I certainly write some literary stuff, and I've been published in literary magazines that I think would be very offended if someone said they publish genre.
Yeah, I guess.
But I think that a lot of times I think about these things like different pieces of things, kind of like food. like you cook a meal and sometimes you want like a really greasy hamburger, and sometimes you want like filet mignon, and sometimes you want a cool vegan thing, and like every different story or everything is more like falls in between that spectrum, so it has all of the different
Yeah.
elements for everything. Like my partner, who is very much a literary writer, he is writing a book right now called Downpour, which is so cool, and he keeps going back and forth because he feels like it's accidentally too genre, and I feel bad about it because I'm kind of like, why? Because things happen. So there's action in it. It's like it's really cool. It takes place like in a version of the UK where like half of the UK is underwater, and this group of like petty criminals gets hired by university to go try and find like a bunch of rare bird specimens in like the drown zone. And
That
it's
sounds
really
interesting
cool.
for sure. Yeah.
But like he's kind of, like, oh, I'm writing genre now. I'm not a real writer anymore.
Oh God,
Which is
no.
really I know, really silly, because also like he's always writing with literary sensibilities. Like he crafts a good sentence. So, like,
I mean, but I can totally understand where he's coming from. Like, I have times when I'm like, am I even a writer? Like, forget literary writer. It's like, what am I doing?
What is this?
What is this? So I can get that. But you're right. Like, it's just that. I mean, this sort of, this boundary, like we were talking about, like how boundaries are fake anyway, this boundary between genre fiction and literary fiction, right? Like, I feel like anybody who obsesses unduly about their paragraphs and their sentences, I guess, are literary writers. We're just like, we wrote this great piece of work, but we're going to obsess about this for another 2 hours or like the whole fucking day, get drunk and have existential dilemmas.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of times when people say literary, they essentially just kind of mean like prose quality. And after that, it isn't, because there are definitely some people who I guess there are some people who are pretty pretentious. It would be like, if it's got a dragon in it, I won't read it. But
oh God, I mean, good luck with that.
Yeah. Also, like, I don't know. I would way rather read something like that than like a short story about a woman who got a nose job and is at a dinner party and now no one's noticing. Like, real short story I read and was like, really? Really? I'm supposed to care about this? Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
it's a great description of a China picture, man.
I'm sure dragons are going to show up in everything in the future. So if somebody's like, I'm not going to read anything with dragons, I mean, they're not going to read anything. Like,
it's the year of the dragon, guys.
Yes, it is.
Get with it. Dragons are everywhere.
I'm wearing red as well. So the next question I had for you was about, again, with boundaries, right? Let's dwell on that a little bit more. Because you write so many different like forms. Like, you're a novelist, you write short stories, you write poetry, you write nonfiction. I'm obsessed with like fiction and nonfiction, right? Like, in the sense that what is fact and fiction, I'm obsessed with like, there is no fact and there is no fiction. It's all the same. So how do you sort of, when you jump between these forms, is it hard for you? Is it easy for you? Is it very natural for you? How's it? What's your experience been like?
Well, it kind of depends. So I definitely write the most fiction. Like, I write fiction all the time. I'm always working on a fiction something, oftentimes many things. Like, right now I have a literary fiction, though I think it probably would have some commercial appeal, like book, and then I have a short story collection. I'm always working on something. I have also got another book that I need to go back to and, make to a place where I could ever show it to anyone. Like, there are a million projects that are shelved and like waiting for me to return to with that. With poetry, I really like poetry, but I'm really slow. Like, you get those rejections from like high tier literary magazines, and they're like, oh, we'd love to see more of your work, and you're like, well, joke's on you, because it'll be 5 years. That's all I had, man. I've got another packet that you want to see, or that's worth showing you. And then nonfiction, I've been told I'm good at it, but I don't write it very often at all. I think it's because I'm very scared of the truth, because the second you're like, I have to be telling the truth, it's like, well, the truth is connected to everything. How do I
Yeah.
tell the story about how I felt trying to move to Alaska without telling, like, my entire life until I was 21 years old? And then how do I reflect on that and be like, oh, but some of those reasons were bad,
Yeah.
or all of that. So I just really have to focus when I do it. So there's probably a
Yeah.
piece for nonfiction that comes maybe once every 5 years again, probably. I
Yeah.
think there will come a time when I like kind of level down and try to write a book that is in it, and I look forward to it, and I'm also terrified for it. YA is really fun, and I always write that because I just don't usually show it to people because it's so much fun, and I just
Yeah.
get to write it for me. You just
Yeah.
have like
I'm
have
sure
kids
it'd be
running through worlds.
yeah. Oh my God, that sounds so interesting. I'm sure that'll be like that'll really, that's the thing, right? Stuff like that gets read a lot more than literary fiction in that sense. Like it has a wider readership, but then you feel like as a literary writer, I need to publish my literary stuff first. Like
It
I've
must be
shoved so many
serious.
things I've written. Yeah, it must be serious. Yeah. So you were talking about how it's hard for you to write poetry, and like, no, I totally get that because I have a bunch of poems sitting with somebody rejected, and then I'm like, I'm not going to send it out for another 5 years because it's like too close to my heart. So I get that about poetry and about nonfiction. Do you think maybe fiction is just less? It takes less out of you, maybe? Like, is that why it's easier to write it? Like, it's because you're sort of distancing yourself from it in a way that you can't do with poetry and nonfiction?
Yeah, I mean, I would say so because, well, when I write poetry or nonfiction, it's so personal, or like
Hmm.
it's so me. Like a lot of my poetry is like, I got a big feeling, and it might
Yeah.
not be written as if that's what it is. No, but like
Yeah.
that's usually where it comes from. And
Yeah.
then like nonfiction or essays are like, there's a big complicated bird's nest of a thing that I want to try to look at, that is
Mm.
usually quite personal, or at least affects me in a personal way.
Mm.
So that is, like how I get into that. Whereas fiction is storytelling. I mean, yeah, of course it's personal in a way, but I'm not trapped in the truth anywhere. I don't have to kind of look at the depth of an emotion that is hard for me. I just kind of like shuffle things around and find things that, I mean, of course there's like a lot of, you do have to do some delving sometimes, especially with like literary works, but you can couch it in different things and rearrange stuff so it looks cleaner. And I don't know, there's just also so much fun to be had in it. Like
Yeah.
world building is fun. Even just playing with like the natural world is fun. Doing research is fun.
Yeah. I love these things.
Like, yeah, like
Yeah.
even though none of this ended up making the cut for PhD book, like I spent 2 days just
Mm.
looking up how glaciers work for a while, because the
Yeah.
Taku Glacier, it recently started receding, but it was still going forward
Mm.
for a long time, and I was like, okay, so how does the moraine work?
Yeah.
What is happening? Like it's just
Yeah.
you get to kind of play and have fun. Poetry is
Yeah.
like very harrowing for me, as is
Mm.
nonfiction.
Yeah. Yeah. I think poetry is the hardest even for me. It's like it comes in the most sort of darkest, or like I think for me it's the darkest times. I don't write poetry when I'm super
Yeah, I know
happy.
that. I know they are silly poets. I've read silly poems, or like poems that have
Yeah.
silly stuff and still get to be serious, or like
Mm.
are about smaller emotions. But like that
I
I
envy
don't
them.
know. That's not
I
me.
envy those people. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, how can you write like that, guys? Like, how are you doing it? But let's talk about the more practical side of writing, right? You tweet a lot about this stuff, which I think is a great thing that you're doing, because
Oh,
even when
thank you.
I was younger, you're welcome. When I was younger, like in my like 20s, when I just started off as a writer, like I was trained as an engineer, so it's not like I always thought I'm going to be a writer. So I was like making these inroads into writing, and this was before my even master's in creative writing. So you always have this imposter syndrome, like, am I even a writer anyway, to start off with, and then people give you horrible rejection letters, and then they're telling you like such horrible shit about your work. And and then, so how do you get over that? Question number one. And question number two, do you think there is value in writers talking about rejections? Like, do we only announce like, yay, I got published, or like, I'm like, I got rejected?
I mean, I think we should talk about getting rejected because it's like the reality of the industry. Like
Yeah.
you're constantly getting rejections.
Hmm.
But I think there's this, and I think there's definitely a perception that like you have to kind of fake it till you make it though, and be like, oh, everything's success, I'm so amazing. You don't talk about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And maybe sure, like maybe I'm uncool because I do get like 50 rejections a year, but also like I get published every year.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
I mean, you've
I
been
think it's
published in
just
like all these amazing places, like, that's the thing, right? Like, you've been published
I
in like
certainly wasn't at
Crosshairs and
first.
yeah,
Yeah,
I guess.
you just keep
Hmm.
trying. Like it is really easy to take stuff seriously. I don't like it takes a lot for a rejection to get to me anymore. The first rejection I
Hmm.
ever got in my entire life was the meanest.
Yeah.
I was 17 years old, and it was like a handwritten rejection. I won't say the magazine it was from,
Oh.
but they literally said your tale just failed to maintain our interest. Like that was the
Oh
wording
my
of it,
God.
and I
Shit.
cried for like 2 days
Yeah.
and all of
Oh
this.
my God.
So,
That is
but like
harsh.
it. Oh yeah, they were so mean. I'll never submit to them again
Yeah.
as long as I live.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but like I mean, rejection's part of it. Now when I get them, I'm kind of like I'm almost happy because it's like, look, here is evidence that I am a writer. And then and you,
Yeah.
you get a tiered one, and you're like, oh really? Like Granta liked that
Yeah.
story. Oh, okay, so all right, that one. Uh,
Yeah.
They've never given me a tiered rejection, and then but it's this story that that's a surprise. You kind of like you
Hmm.
celebrate those almost like a similar win.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, I don't
Do
know.
you think,
Sorry, go on.
sorry, go on. No, I was going to
I
say
mean, I
that,
was
like, do you take constructive feedback at all from these sort of rejection comments?
if they give specifics, which sometimes happens in the tiered ones,
Hmm.
like I've definitely seen some of it. I've heard one. I'm thinking of one specifically that said something where I was kind of like, that's probably true, but
Hmm.
I don't want to change it, and I'm not going to because it'd be a different story.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that
Uh,
happens a lot.
other Yeah, but there are others that are like, good. Like I think I got one from the Harvard Review once on a story that was like, we just found some of this phrasing at the end a bit too sentimental. And I
Yeah.
like thought about it, and when I mean it was years later when I came back to the story. It was like something I wrote, I was like 20. But when I came back to it, I reread it and I found that I agreed. I wasn't even thinking
Yeah.
about them, but I got to the end and I was like, oh, that is, and like
Yeah.
you kind
So
of.
here, yeah, I was going
Sorry,
to
I think we
say,
have a
here's an
lag, which
other
is why that goes
question.
that way.
Yeah. Now, I was going to say that, another question that I like asking writers is about, like, is there a story or a book or something that you wrote, like, you write it, and then 2 years, 3 years later, you're still like, you still want to publish it, maybe, but then that book does not represent you anymore. Like, that is not how you write anymore. And you're sort of ashamed by it a little bit, but then you're like, I put so much effort into this. Now I want to see it published, but does it really represent me? Like, do you ever have that feeling?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, there are two things that come directly to mind. One is like the YA book, which I am now like querying for and adding a little bit more interior to. But like, I mean, I first started writing it like God 10 years ago, and but I had like a really bad couple of years, like just like a really hard time. And so when I came back to it, like I had to stop writing it because it just wasn't. I couldn't anymore. Like it wasn't where I was at or any of that. And I've obviously come back to that. It's different now. The whole plot has changed. And then I have though this is something that did get published. I have a couple of stories. One story in particular I'm thinking of, which I will not name because I don't want people to go find it. It isn't a bad story. It's technically a good story, but it's essentially just like, like a 20-something being a bad person and feeling like a bad person and feeling bad about themselves and their romantic choices in Alaska. And like, yeah, when I was like 22, that was very much what I was going through. But to me, it's now kind of embarrassing.
Yeah.
I don't do a lot of romantic pining with all of my being anymore, even if I wrote about it well.
It wouldn't sound the same now if you wrote the same story. Like it would not be like that many pages.
It wouldn't. I would not write that story now. There's nothing wrong with it. It just like it is not within my field of interest.
Yeah. No, I totally get that because that I'm so embarrassed even by my like first novel now. Like sometimes I feel, oh my God, like why did I publish that? Like, but that's the thing. I guess you gotta publish the stuff that you write because at that particular time when you wrote it, it was, whatever it was. So
it was. It was the story that had a somewhat sentimental ending.
Yeah.
I kind of try to think. I think about it a little bit the way I think about tattoos because I'm relatively heavily tattooed. You can't really see because I'm wearing this fantastic fisherman knit sweater.
No, I wish you could have seen it. I'll put up pictures on the transcript.
Well, I mean, I have a lot of tattoos. People will often ask me. They'll be like, "Oh, I could never do that. Like, what if you get something that you don't like as much later?" And I'll be like, "Well, yeah, I have those tattoos." But they're like, I mean, it's kind of like a map of who you used to be. You're like, look at little 18-year-old Mirri. She was so cute.
Yeah. But you do have amazing. So I must say to everyone listening that Mirri has amazing tattoos. Like you should totally.
I did not draw them. They're just there.
Yeah. But what sort of tattoos do you have? Like, is it like characters from books and things like that, or like what is it?
They are all book based. So they are all line drawings. A lot of them are wood blocks. Like I have a bunch of the wood block chapters from Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. And only specific ones, but I have some ones that are from that, like the chapter of the Tower of O, and things. So they're all kind of like, they're all line drawings. I don't have any color on me at all. I don't have any shading on. Actually, I think I might have a bird shaded somewhere in like the really early stuff I got when I was like 19. There might be some shading there.
Yes.
It's not because I think those things look, I think that's bad or I think that's not the way tattoos should be. It's just when I thought about tattoos that I wanted, that is what I wanted. And I didn't realize it was so specific for a really long time. And probably around like my 5th tattoo, like I was like in the shop and like the guy who was tattooing me was like commenting on like how I have like the very specific style and how he likes it and all of that. And I was like, I hadn't even thought about it. Like, those were the images that looked to me like they should be tattoos.
Yeah, you do have a very specific style of tattoo, which is why I brought it up, right? The first time I saw it, I was
like it's got arms, cool. Like it kind of.
Yeah.
You see, like
there it is. Yeah,
it's like a
nice.
castle.
I love that.
So, well, it's not really a castle, but it's like a city.
It's a nice one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I figured that since if there's a video, I should do something. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So, let me ask you my last question because we're coming to the end of this lovely discussion that we've had. What would you say right now in your sort of, you've also been doing your PhD and you've written, critical stuff, I'm assuming, for your thesis. So how has that been? Do you like referencing and citing and all of that? Like, what are your feelings about that?
I don't like it. I love reading it. I love reading all of the things that I got to read. And I'd probably love to have that conversation. I love those sorts of things. But I've always found academic writing to be somewhat of a chore. Which is sort of silly to say because I used to teach it, but I mean, I taught it because I had to. Uh, like there's nothing wrong with it. Like, it's kind of formulaic, and that's how you structure an argument, and that's how you have those goalposts. But I don't find a lot of joy in that. I think a lot of it's just like, you get like fraud syndrome because I wasn't an English major. I never studied literature really. I was like Russian international studies and anthropology, which is a very different type of
Wow.
writing and a very different type
Yeah.
of academic writing. People don't really seem to grasp how different it is, but it is. And I don't even know that I was that great at those kinds of papers when I was writing them when I was like 20. I know how to do it now, but a lot of it to me still just feels very forced. I know that there's such joy to be had in that things for some people. It's because it's figuring out how to articulate like these complex, beautiful thoughts you have and ideas. And I have loved thinking because my critical is very like about being, because it's about like Nan Shepherd and like sort of representations of wilderness beyond gender and her work, the living mountain. And so like I've loved reading all that and like the philosophy of it, but the actual writing of it I find very painful.
Yeah, I mean, there is something to be said about how academic writing can sort of suck the creativity out. Like it can become sort of very formulaic, like you said. Like I've been trying to push at that boundary a lot, and I'm just like hitting a wall a lot of times because it's not easy to sort of push that boundary because it's written in a particular way.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to say it's, well, no, I feel like it's kind of gatekeepy because there's all these unwritten rules that you don't know unless you already come from it and nobody really tells you about, and you have to do it a certain way. And I mean, it's like translation, right? You're translating, these ideas and these things you have read into a very specific style to be taken seriously, and also a style that does help you articulate better. Like it does, and that is why it's there. That is important. But I find it very stressful. I'd much rather just have conversations. We can like bring stacks of like 12 books and talk that way and find the citing that way.
But we should start a school together where we do just like we're like, you don't have to cite anything, just show me the book, I will trust you.
Show me the book. It's not so you find the page number. It's 15 minutes while everyone like maddeningly page through. I know why it exists, but it's not the kind of writing that I love.
Yeah. No, totally. Because I just wanted to see what you thought about it. Because I don't come from a humanities background either, so I sort of like learned how to do critical writing. Like I'm like, oh, this is how you do it. Like you mentioned, like all these sort of unsaid things that you just learn from just reading more of it, I guess. Like you're like, oh yeah, this is how this is done, this is how this is done. Nobody taught me that. Like I just had to learn it on the go. So and it was not something I enjoy either. So I get it.
I remember like they asked me to write an abstract, like a 1-page abstract. So I did, and I didn't really understand what it was because I'd never written an abstract before, never had to. Certainly not one for like, like a lit crit thing. And so I just titled it like 1-page abstract, and my advisors were like, that's a bit cheeky. And I was kind of like, is it? I wouldn't think to say anything. I just don't know.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, obviously it's changed and it's fine now. I learned. It's not like I didn't know how to do academic writing before I came. It's just like it was very different.
I know. Anyhow, so we are drawing to the end of this long, lovely conversation. Thank you so much, Mirri, for joining me and talking about all this stuff. So I'm going to put up a bunch of links to your, your work and like your website and everything. So people want to check out all the stuff that she's spoken about. It's all going to be there. So thank you so much for joining me, Mirri. I shall now disconnect.
Oh, thank you so much, Sindhu.